Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We have a few people here. I'm sure that more will join as the time proceeds. This is the latest episode of our informal series of webinars that we've run here at JCFJ. In the past, before COVID, we used to regularly host what we called the brown bag lunches, where we would invite an expert speaker of some kind to address us, have a conversation after their talk, and eat together. Sadly, because the COVID cases are so kind of dire here in Dublin, we're not going to be able to share our sandwiches together today. But on the plus side, it means that people from further afield are able to join us and reflect on this important issue together. My name is Kevin Hargaden. I'm the director of the Jesuit Centre for Faith and Justice, where I work as a social theologian. That job title makes it sound a bit like I get to take people for pints to talk about God, which wouldn't actually be a bad idea, but it in fact means that I'm given the job of thinking about the connection between Christian belief and our wider society. And there are a few issues that are more pressing in our age within our wider society than racism. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Taido Chino today to help us to explore that question. What does it mean that God is not white? I first met Dr. Chino almost 10 years ago. We spent a couple of very happy years together sharing an office in the attic of a very old building right by the North Sea in Aberdeen. And I can honestly say that there are very few people from whom I have learned more in my life than Taido. He has a PhD from Aberdeen University. He did his postdoc at the acclaimed Tübingen University in Bavaria under the legendary and sadly recently deceased theologian Christoph Strobel. And for the last few years, he's been teaching at a small liberal arts college in Illinois called Augustana College. One of his responsibilities there is to help students think about how American society has been shaped by Christianity. And so that means he spent the last couple of years thinking an awful lot about how Christianity has been shaped by racism. The plan for our session today is that Taido and I will have a sort of informal dialogue about race and Christianity. And through that time, you can add questions as they occur to you in the Q&A box, which you see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. To the best of our knowledge, those questions can be made anonymously. So this is a safe space and you can ask whatever question you like and don't think, oh, that's a dumb question or that's an obnoxious or an insulting question, or don't allow any kind of self-censorship to occur. If the question occurs to you, it's almost certain that someone else will appreciate you raising your voice, or in this case, typing out your thoughts. At the end of about a half an hour of a conversation, my colleague Martina Madden, who's keeping track of all those questions, will take over and share a more open conversation. So without stating the obvious, I would like to say that I am delighted to have Dr. Chino here, and he's come to join us, of course, on American Thanksgiving. So thank you very much, Taido.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. And I think something appropriate about talking about Christianity and its complicity with racism on an American holiday like this. And so it's a delight to be able to come and join all of you. And as you've expressed, think through something that is crucially important in not just the American context, but increasingly in other places as well. And so, I'm excited about the time that we're going to be able to share together. And I should, just from the outset, by the way, in addition to thanking you for the invitation to come and share, is to just recognize that I am very much working out of an American context, and recognize that the way racism expresses itself from one place to the next is really quite different. And so a lot of the examples that I'll be sort of sharing about are the ways it's manifested in American culture, and American church culture in particular. It might look, it's definitely going to look very different from one place to the next. And so I'm really grateful to have the chance to be in kind of a dialogue with you, for you to be able to kind of help understand how it might take shape in this context. So
absolutely,
yeah. And I'm also aware just of the time constraints. This is a massive topic, and we could spend, right, books and books and books are being written around all of this. And so in some ways we're just scratching the surface, but I do hope that the time that we get to spend together is productive.
Absolutely. I'm quietly confident that you and I might be able to say something, at least we'll be interested and hopefully everyone else will as well. Taido, the question that I think is important to start off with is, when did you first become aware that the church had a problem with race?
Yeah, that's an interesting question with an interesting response. I came to faith pretty late adolescence, early adulthood. I was maybe 18 or so, and I started dating. I lived in, this is actually important. I lived in Arkansas. I come from the great state of Arkansas, where a former president that some of you might be familiar with also hails from, Bill Clinton. This is in the American South, and I graduated from high school there and attended my undergraduate there. And I started dating as a young woman, and her grandmother was a kindly old lady, as sweet as could be. She was a prominent kind of pillar of the community. She taught what's called like a organized Bible study that hundreds and hundreds of women during her sort of leadership in that ministry would have come under. She was well recognized, well loved, well respected, and in many ways was just a delightful person to be around. But when I started dating her granddaughter, I became aware, she didn't tell me directly, she's too sweet an old lady to do that, but I did become aware that she had an issue with my dating her daughter. Her daughter was Caucasian, and I could wrap my head around, because I encountered racism before, but she had a biblical justification for doing this. And the way, and I can still remember it, the way the reasoning as it was explained to me back then was arguing out of a particular verse in the Bible, out of the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, and I don't remember the exact verse, but the verse goes something along the lines of this, where there is a prohibition against breeding two different kinds of cattle together, or mixing together two different kinds of material to create a fabric for clothing. And the suggestion from that was that there is a non-mixing principle established in the Bible, that God doesn't want to mix things that don't belong together. So you take that verse, and then you go to other verses in the Old Testament that often talk about that the Israelites weren't to marry foreigners, and I could understand that a little bit. But I was still very young in the faith, and I'm trying to understand what does any of this have to do with me today. And but those kinds of verses were brought up as a biblical justification for not getting involved with people romantically from another race. And again, I'm very young to the faith, but even I recognized in my inability to sort of navigate the complexities of Scripture that something seemed a little bit off there, and I couldn't put my finger on it at the time. I just thought, oh, this is some old lady who has some weird views about the Bible or whatever. But so I moved on from that experience, not very faith. I say I moved on from. I did actually end up marrying this young woman that I was dating, and actually, I should go back and circle back to her credit. Despite the fact that she might not have been all that excited about it, she became one of my most ardent fans later on. She would attend the church that I would minister at. She would very complimentary of the kind of ministry that I was engaged in. But it took me some years to recognize that she wasn't a one-off, that she wasn't doing some kind of strange thing that other people hadn't also been doing, but that she actually stands at the kind of the culmination of a long line of approaching the Scriptures to sort of justify various kinds of racist ideologies. And so that was my first encounter with it. And really it put me on a kind of decades-long journey of discovering actually there has been a long history of wielding Christianity and the Scriptures to sort of support these various racist projects.
And I think that's very important, because when you told me that story at first, it was kind of you told it to me in a jovial fashion, and we were able to kind of laugh at this this silly viewpoint, but it is in fact deeply embedded within the history of the Christian church. Do you think that the church is alert to its own history of racism?
No, and I would say that's maybe one of the most significant problems that the church is facing, is that it has neglected to think about this history, to reflect on it, to potentially repent from it. And its lack of awareness of this long history of a racist implication, and the church's implications in it is detrimental. I share that, or you shared that I teach at Augustana College, and so I'm working primarily with undergraduates, and it was in this context that I was, not for the first time, made aware of just the ignorance around the history of Christianity's complicity with racism. But it's striking that I'll be teaching undergraduates, relatively serious-minded students, and yet they're just completely ignorant of this history. And so a lot of the work that I find myself doing is needing to sort of unpack that long story, one that really stretches back to it begins with the beginning of America, and the colonial projects that the various European nations were enacting during the 16th century and forward were needed a kind of, that's when race actually began to sort of come into focus, at least in the way in which we begin to understand it today. We hear a lot about race being a social construct, and because it is, but that construct had to emerge at a certain point in time, and that's, people have different ideas about when this really came into effect. But race as a way of organizing bodies really came to expression during this colonial period, and I think that it's telling that it's during this period of time when not only are sort of empires expanding, but along with it, there's a religious backing that is needing to reframe the story in such a way that one can show up into a new place, into a new land, and have to sort of imagine how it is that Christianity is meant to be sort of a propelling force in this new place, and the kinds of recategorizations of kind of the value of human bodies, of Black bodies and brown bodies that are the mental and theological gymnastics to do that are profound, I think, and it's one that is deeply embedded in the kind of Christianity that gets imported, that animates the project from its entirety, from the very beginning.
Yeah, I think too few people recognize, it's too easy for us to assume that because there's something intrinsic in human beings that like to understand the world in terms of us and them. And, it's very easy for me, as, where I grew up in a town called Leixup, there was another part of Leixup called Confey, which was up the hill. And so as children, we were the far enders and they were the hillers, and there shall never be peace between these two tribes. And we kind of read that out and imagine that therefore racism is a kind of natural thing. And on that level, it is. But actually, when we talk about racism and the consequences of racism, say, for example, in the United States, that's a distinctive colonial project that dates to 400 years ago. And we know this to be the case because in 1200 AD, European Christians didn't think you could own slaves. And by 1600 AD, European Christians were fully legitimating a slave-owning state. And the missing piece there is the racial hierarchy that was not fabricated out of nothing, but certainly theologically imagined at that point.
I think it's important to keep kind of separate the ethnocentrism is one thing, right? And racist sort of projects are another thing, and they're linked in some kinds of meaningful way. But And one of the mistakes that I think that at least the church in America sometimes does is it wants to read, this is just how profound that the racist construct has kind of overtaken, is to read racism back into the scriptures, to talk about scripture in such a way as to say it's dealing with issues of race, and it's to say, well, no, actually it's dealing with issues of us and them, and ethnicity maybe is playing a part into that, but it's not necessarily. Race as a category didn't exist at the time when the scriptures were being written, and that's just telling in my mind that how much it's overtaken our imagination about the shape of the world, that we tend to read everything through the category of race.
So would it be true to say that the church doesn't know what racism is? Is that too bold a claim?
I think it's absolutely the case that and not only does it not know, it doesn't know on multiple fronts what racism
is. Say more about that, like unpack what that means.
So I don't know what the participants who are sort of showing up for today, the kinds of ecclesial backgrounds that they are necessarily coming out of, but I come out of one that is American evangelical kind of expression of Christianity. And it's one that tends to view race or racism as an individual, as a personal problem, a personal sin problem. That the reason that we have racism in the world is that there are individual people who have racist views and who have enacted racist kinds of actions. And so that's the only lens that they are able to sort of see the problem of racism through. And so that when they're evaluating whether or not racism is a problem, all they're ever really doing is looking at themselves and or their neighbors and saying, I'm not a racist, and I've never owned slaves, and neither have the people who are sitting next to me. Then they might even genuinely think we don't believe in segregation. We think that that schools ought to be integrated. Right? We're not living in that age. Therefore, how can I be racist? I think everyone should be treated fairly and humanely. So as long as I think this is the case, and as long as the people I know who I kind of go to church with think this is the case, why are we making a big deal about this? So it's reduced to sort of an individual's attitudes and actions, and that's fine. That is a component of racism. Right? If there were no racist individuals, then potentially there would be no racism on a more grand scale. But then on the other end of the thing, and this is, again, I'm just playing out how the conversation works out in the American context, and there's vigorous debate. So on the other end of the spectrum is to think of it systemically. That racism it's not individual. Yes, individuals might be racist, but the real problem of racism is that it's so deeply embedded in the structures of our society, whether it's things having to do with economics, economic disparities, and recognizing that certain races face, not just certain races, but identifiable races are lower on the economic scale than on the socioeconomic scale than white Americans. Or right, the list could go on and on where the structural pieces show up, that with overwhelming majority in the American prison system that it is African Americans who find themselves imprisoned over white Americans. What housing practices for generations of a practice that was called redlining, where it was both the people who were making zoning decisions and realtors were coming alongside. Everyone was sort of cooperating to keep certain races out of certain neighborhoods, and that this practice was ordained. And importantly, that these are all Christians of a sort who are engaged in these kinds of practices. So it's the systemic nature of it, right? That is coming on. And so the debate that happens in the church is between this: is it an individual problem or is it a systemic problem? And there's no imagination for trying to think through it in terms other than that.
Yeah.
How does that? I don't know if that kind of debate is being replicated here in Ireland.
Well, the debate in Ireland is present and is rich where it occurs. There are organizations who are very capable of introducing people to these conversations. I think of the Dublin City Interfaith Forum, who are not obviously addressing racism particularly, but they are full of people who are alert to these kinds of conversations. But I would say that generally the Irish Church, again, broad generalizations with lots of exceptions, has a real problem with grasping racism because of our imagination on this question being shaped by American popular culture. So we think that racists are people who wear white sheets over their head and go and put burning crosses on the lawns of nice African American people. And if you're not like a kind of caricature Ku Klux Klan member, then you are not a racist. And that allows us a kind of a double movement. We can project racism onto the other. Those Americans have a racial problem, and we can obscure the racism present in our society. So it's not like, and I'm not making a direct comparison, but you've talked about economic inequality, penal policy, and housing provision. And we have an ethnic class of people in Ireland who are disproportionately impoverished, who are disproportionately imprisoned, and who live in temporary halting sites on the edges of towns, absolutely kept out of stable housing by good Christian, upstanding, moral people. And that class of people is called travelers. So our race discourse, if it adopts the pointers and cues from the United States or from the United Kingdom, a very important and vibrant conversation will occur. But it also might be a vibrant conversation that allows us to avoid the most pressing example of both individual and systemic racism in our society, the prejudice that we have against travelers. So I think that, unpacking the difference between, the bog standard, anthropological basis of human beings like people who are like them, and they are skeptical of people who are different from them.
Sure.
And making a clear distinction between that and racism is an important first step, so that we're able to recognize the ways in which our society is racist. It's not just a problem that other people have. It's such an ironic kind of devilish little formulation that we have here. So I think that the stuff that you're describing has direct relevance, and maybe in our wider discussion, others will be able to feed into that.
Yeah.
So would you say that a task facing the church, both in the United States and elsewhere, is to offer an alternative that manages to transcend the either individual or structural response?
Yeah, if I had the solution for how to solve racism, I'd be...
Well, presumably you'd still be here with us.
That's right. That's right.
But you'd also be having conversations with other people too. Yeah.
No, even more so. But in all of my sort of thinking around this, I mean, I am interested in a liberal arts context, sort of helping students sort of begin to understand these sorts of things. But I actually have a genuine concern that the church would be able to more profoundly think about the ways in which they might respond to and address problems of racism that emerge in their contexts. And I don't think that it's a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. But I think part of when I look at the American church, and again, I'm speaking about that which I know best, part of what I'm struck with is and it's not like they're not responding to the questions around race and problems of race. It's just that they're inadequate, and that they are, I'll say it this way, their discourse mimics the kind of discourse that happens in broader culture. And there's no theological imagination for the ways in which the church might have something distinctive to offer or say into this conversation. And that's what troubles me. And so part of what I think the church needs to spend some more time doing is to thinking of a properly kind of Christian and or theological response to this issue. And I think that needs to happen on several fronts. And firstly, it's that churches would simply recognize racism for what it is, which is sin. And most churches can, quite frankly, get there pretty quickly. It's not that difficult. Churches, at least that I'm aware of, they're willing to say, yeah, racism is sin. But that's about the end of the theological reflection that they tend to do around this, which is a shame, because I think the church is relatively well equipped it has a history of reflecting on what is the Christian solution, so to speak, for thinking about sin and overcoming, as much as one's able to, sin and the practices of sin in the world. And more and more, I think it's a framework of, the theological word for it is reconciliation. And I think that's the work the church needs to begin to think about, and not in superficial ways, but in a sort of processed way. And the value, I think, of being able to have a framework of reconciliation in place allows for a kind of capaciousness for the different kinds of ways that, whether it's on an individual level, on an institutional level, and individuals and institutions of various kinds. So, for example, in America, one recent example is Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and it's recognition that they were involved in the practice of slavery. They profited at a time when they needed to. In the 19th century, they sold 272 slaves for a sum of money. And they have made efforts recently to want to make reparations for that. And I think it explicitly in a process of reconciliation. And so they, as best they've been able to, identify the descendants of those slaves, and to begin to make kinds of remunerations, not just to them individually, but to the communities that they're a part of, and keeping an open door to wanting them to be able to participate in the life of the community that they have. And so I think that's a kind of gesture, but that wouldn't make sense. That's a good thing for a college to do, but how might a church go about doing it somehow differently? And I've been a part of churches that have been interested in trying to work a process of reconciliation in their own context. So, for example, the church I was a part of in Arkansas recognized that in our context, segregation has left a lasting mark, even to this present day. And we want to begin to repair the damage done by segregation. And so they would host, as part of their discipleship curriculum, a kind of series of sessions that would help white parishioners to be able to sort of recognize the ways in which racism has damaged their communities. And we had Black parishioners as well, and they were coming together and having honest conversations about the ways in which each other perceive one another. And over some time, relationships were being built to sort of undo the work that had. And we were under no illusions that you have a few sessions and all of a sudden the process is done. But it was a movement towards reconciliation that you just don't find space for in that many ecclesial communities.
It's fascinating to think about a church self-consciously, or a Christian community self-consciously trying to conceive of what it means to be an agent of reconciliation in the aftermath of racial hatred and prejudice. But I suspect that most churches and most kind of Christian organizations, the Jesuits, Georgetown University, they have the bandwidth and the capacity and the resources to think that through coherently. Yeah. But how does a parish who recognizes that there's a problem in Ireland with our colonial legacy, that's incredibly complicated. We were colonized, sure, and yet Irish people were also agents of imperialism. And then we have the very recent and dramatic and largely successful influx of what we call the New Irish. And then we have that kind of latent, long-lasting refusal to consider the place of the traveler in our society. That's a big mix of problems. And I can imagine all kinds of ways that could go wrong, even on a pastoral level. With the best will in the world, you end up tearing the congregation apart with conflict. So how does an ordinary parish try to pursue that question? Is there anywhere that you would point them, say scripturally? You talk about theological imagination. How do you begin that?
Yeah, I am encouraged that we aren't the first church communities that have had to sort of think through this. And as you suggest, that there are places in Scripture where we actually get to see this on display in a different context, obviously. But so I would go to Acts chapter 6, where there we're told that there was a discrimination of sorts taking place between the Greek Jews and the Israelite Jews and the Hebraic Jews, and that the widows weren't receiving the allotment that they needed for life, and that this was brought to the attention of the church leaders, and that they thought and prayed about this, and they made a decision to appoint some people to take care of the social needs of the widows in a way that was equitable. And I think that's real telling, the creativity to say, we just don't have the bandwidth to take care of these social needs. Our primary task is in preaching and teaching and this kind of thing. And so a kind of outsourcing, if you will, and it wasn't outsourcing because these are part of the people who are part of the community and such, but to recognize we need people who are dedicated to this task. And frankly, I think modern day churches could learn from that as well. I just don't think the church context that I've been in, local church leaders have the capacity for the deep kind of reflection that needs to take place. And so to have, for example, an organization like JCFJ, which is able to think through really complicated issues and be able to have that kind of reflection brought back into the church, whether it's around issues around race or prison, or the ways that the disparities show up in all kinds of surprising ways that people in the church would never have even imagined. Lots of church people don't recognize that when, so for example, climate change is taking place, and that the effects of climate change are going to disproportionately affect people who are brown and black. No, they're not thinking about that. They're thinking about, what am I doing with my straw, my plastic straw? And that, so those kinds of questions haven't been brought to bear on what I would call the average churchgoer in America, or even the average church leader in America. And so to have resources that they can draw from outside of themselves, I think is crucial.
I like that. We're JCFJ as deacons of social analysis. That's something I can run with, maybe. It's very interesting, Taido. I'm aware of time. We want to honor the lunch hour. And I see that there are questions. So I might invite Martina to come in and to kind of take over, and we'll have a more open conversation. Would that be okay?
Yep, that'd be great.
Hi, Taido. Thank you very much for that. That was really interesting. We've got a couple of interesting questions in as well. I feel that a couple of them have been answered partially, but maybe you'd like to elaborate on them. One from Richard Carson asks, aside from this wonderful webinar, how can we challenge the racializing of the church that assumes that racism is not a social construct, but only an individual behavior trait? What should our witness look like in practice, particularly when the view is so deeply embedded? So I guess it's more about personal behavior.
Yeah. I think it's, at least the context that I find myself working in, rooting out sort of that individualism. If it's not a personal problem for me, then I don't recognize it as a problem. I think that's a really crucial work. And so flagging up the systemic nature of racism, and I think that people can grab a hold of that. It's critical race theory and talk of systemic racism is a kind of bogeyman in the American context right now. I don't know how familiar you might be, but there are places that are forbidding, states are going through the process of forbidding questions around systemic racism being taught as curriculum in school. And I think that the churches, frankly, the more that churches can become aware of this, they need to be kind of representatives and advocates for, no, that we don't have to be afraid of talking about these issues. We can think about these kinds of things without undermining sort of our commitment to the Christian gospel the idea that the two things are antithetical is being pressed in certain church contexts in America, and I can understand the concern, but it seems to be misguided in my imagination. So I think that's part of what the idea is to help people come to terms with. There's ways into this that are that help to illumine the gospel as opposed to diminish it.
Thank you.
Can I come in on that, Martina, if possible?
Of course.
I'm thinking about this because Taido and I are both from kind of Reformed Christian backgrounds, but we're talking to a largely Catholic audience, and I'm representing a Catholic organization. And I think that there's, in terms of Richard talks about witness, it looks like in practice, and I think that the obvious place for church communities, both Reformed and Catholic, to go to is the communion table. That Eucharist is it's an act of remembering. Do this in memory of me. But remembering doesn't just mean the cognitive recall of an event that happened once in an upper room in Jerusalem before Jesus's trial. Remembering is putting the body of Christ back together again, and recognizing that already in Ireland, one of the most socially diverse places you'll ever hope to be is in church on a Sunday. It is one of the few places where really rich people who are well established in Ireland rub shoulders with and have to engage with the new Irish and with recent arrivals and with people who are not so well established. And so the fact that we all come to that table equally, and we all come to that table in equally desperate need, is a kind of liturgical basis by which the church can bear witness to the reality that Christianity declares, that there is no Jew nor Greek, there is no slave nor free, there is no male or female in Christ, that there is proper, genuine, radical equality. So I think that there are really obvious places where church leaders would be able to kind of start to weave a story about racism that's different from you're either a snowflake, liberal, woke person who is concerned with racial microaggressions, that caricature, or you're a conservative troglodyte who doesn't care about racial justice. Christianity has resources to actually tell a different story besides that polarization, and it begins with the very basic fundamental practices of our shared life. So that would be my answer to Richard in terms of the practice doesn't end at the table, but it can at least begin there.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. And I'm glad that you brought up that church is one of the places where that's genuinely diverse in Irish life, because that was another question that I wanted to ask Taido and yourself about the Irish context, because when speaking about the churches, it's if it's a monolith of white people, which of course it's not the case. And I wondered if you could speak, Taido, about the US experience or of racial groups within churches.
Say it again. I missed maybe the first
I know, sorry, it was a little bit garbled. When speaking about the church and racism in the churches, it's as if we're speaking about a monolith of white people, but of course that's not the case. And here in the Irish context, we know that the traveller community is largely Catholic. And I wondered if you could speak about the US context for racial groups within churches.
Yeah. Well, part of the American legacy has been that we have segregation ran so deep that we were able successfully to form monocultural churches for generations that would be exclusively white or exclusively African American or exclusively Asian American, and on and on. And it has really only been in the last, I would say, 25, 30 years that there has been work towards overcoming that. And it is genuinely real work to try to overcome these monocultural silos. And that's, I would say, I'm speaking out of a Protestant context. I recognize that the Catholic Church in America is going to take on a different flavor. But the other interesting thing is that one of the things that I appreciate getting to share with my students is the ways in which Christianity has provided resources there's the negative side, that it has been used as a tool of oppression in say Civil War times or post-Civil War times as well, but that it's also been used as a tool, as a possibility for liberation, and that the communities themselves, so African Americans have been historically committed to Christianity as a people group in America, and that it's been a tremendous place for them to recognize that the white gospel, so to speak, is not the only version of the gospel, and so to be able to look to Christianity as a means for providing encouragement and support, and it's the lifeblood in some ways for many African American communities that have been beaten down for centuries now. So, and a similar story could be told for Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans as well. I mean, some of the more robust frankly, where Christianity is growing, even in America, it's with minority groups over and against Caucasian Americans. So it's just an interesting mix of kind of religious dynamic in our country.
I think that's one of the things that I look forward to in the coming decades in Ireland. Like, the church is obviously in decline, is being chastened, humbled, disciplined for many things that happened in the 20th century. And it's right and proper that the church in some ways will be shrinking and losing influence, having in many ways squandered the opportunity to represent for peace and for justice. But what that means is that the church is also wide open to being reimagined, because so much of the dynamism in the church comes from the New Irish. And there's just a real possibility that this monoculture that Martina refers to, the church that Irish people imagine is a bunch of old white men, is already kind of in churn. And at the end of that, it's going to be a very different thing from a Western European reaction against British imperialism, which is obviously, the church was more than that. I feel the academic in me wanting to qualify my statements. But what I'm saying is that because it is such a diverse place already, we're in a situation where, as one of these questions has asked, am I hopeful that the church's problems of racism can be transformed? I think I'm quietly confident that there will be a transformation, simply because the Irish church was going to have to start listening to the New Irish. As a function of the decline, there's also the seeds for the renewal. I see as well, Martina, there's a question from Damien Jackson in the chat box as opposed to in the Q&A box.
Okay, well, I'll get to that now in a moment. I have another question here from Irene McGuire that I'll get to now. While open to symbolic gestures such as that of Georgetown to repair past harms, such gestures also need to become accompanied by ensuring the embedding racial structures are addressed, such as college governance, promotional policies, student access, community engagements, to dismantle and rebuild new ways of ensuring equality and inclusion for all, especially women and non-white persons. Thoughts?
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. And I'm aware that the Georgetown example, it has been met with some criticism, and I'm sympathetic to that criticism. There's a kind of one wants to guard against at least a couple of things: the performative nature of it, which I don't. Right at that point, you're trying to evaluate intentions, and that's always a difficult thing to do. But in the American context, they would be hard pressed not to begin to make a kind of a university like this to make reparations like that. Of course, there are plenty of universities that would have just blithely ignore it, but then that as Irene, I believe that's the name, has intimated, that the idea that it would terminate at sort of as a sort of a fiscal transaction of sorts would be a real tragedy, quite frankly. And it doesn't, because and I think Irene has mentioned more like longstanding and embedded structures and these kind of reconfiguring different aspects of it. all of which I would think are more helpful steps, not more helpful, additional helpful steps in fulfilling, again, this idea of a full-scale reconciliation that I'm suggesting, which is that is a broader, more broadly applied, and that there would be space in the midst of that for real human beings to make real connections and a kind of genuine reconciliation where both repentance is enacted and forgiveness is extended. Those kinds of things, I think, can get papered over if we imagine it as simply being a matter of economic restitution.
I heard a very illustrative, illuminating story about a young African-American student who attended a Christian college who was trying very hard to think this stuff through. And they did a lot of the stuff that Irene alludes to in terms of kind of undoing the embedded racial structures by actively recruiting excellent scholars of color. And they definitely had promotional policies, you know, in inner city urban areas that were disproportionately Black and educationally disadvantaged. They went in the summer and ran all kinds of programs to try to bring students in. And this very fine young student rocked up to this college and committed to to go here instead of to somewhere where he might visually fit in better. Like there's a rich tradition of African-American colleges that you could go to. And instead he went to this place that was traditionally white, and they had done all that structural stuff. And on the first week of his first year, he and his Black friend were stopped by security guards on campus and you know, quite confrontationally asked to prove that they had a right to be there. And over the course of the 4 years that they spent there, none of his white classmates ever received that kind of treatment from the security officials. So what does that say? It says that we need to adapting Catholic social teaching language. What's required here is some kind of integrated reconciliation that both deals with the structural problems in a serious and robust way, has measures to stop the performative nature, you know, so that it's a PR and marketing campaign, and also that's seeking to address that individual repentance that's required, because all the best practice documents in the world don't make a difference if you're also allowing actual individuals to go around benignly. I'm sure those security guards would, like Taido has described, say, you know, I believe in equality. I haven't got a racist bone in my body. And yet that was a formative experience for that young man that he carries with him years later. So I think that Irene's put her finger really on just how deep a problem this is. But that's not me saying, oh, well, there's nothing to do. I think that there are lots of ways that the church can think that through holistically. Sorry, Martina,
No, you're absolutely
almost
fine.
Getting into preacher mode there. Yeah,
you're okay. I'll get on with the next question. Thank you for pointing it out, Damien Jackson in the chat box. Here in the Irish Council of Churches with Vox magazine, we've just run a survey on this topic. But one of our main findings was an overwhelming proportion of people agree that racism is an issue and really want to talk about it, about 90%. However, leaders perhaps lacking confidence or courage to do so. The responses show that there will be vehement pushback, but only from a small, loud proportion. Do you think that's the case in the US, Taido? How can we encourage leadership to be brave and intentional on this?
Yeah, what a great question. And I do think that's possible that the dynamics in the US are a little different right now. Questions around race are becoming a kind of litmus test. And so people are lining up. If one wants to talk about race, one is becoming a kind of social gospel person, liberal, wanting to sort of pull away from sort of the traditional Orthodox Christianity, you know, and I've encountered it personally. I hear stories of it repeatedly. I wish it was just sort of a kind of a Trumpian sort of thing. But that it's more broad ranging than that. There is a sense in which one wonders that maybe a generation of white evangelical Christians really are feeling threatened in some way, and that they see conversations around race as threatening sort of their core identity, and what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a faithful church doing the work of God in society and the world. And so, and again, I think it maybe has to do with this nagging individualism where they think that they aren't racist. They just don't think it's a problem. They think that they have dealt with it, and because that they have, their children went to schools with people of a different color or something like this, that what's the big deal? And so, that being said, I also know a lot of churches that do want to have this conversation, and so I think we're at a kind of tipping point. But if we can't break out of sort of this polarized culture war, then I'm not skeptical. I think that there are going to be churches that are willing to do kind of the long, hard work of trying to think through it and do so in a meaningful way with the help of other organizations to provide a kind of robust response. But just because of the fractured nature of the church in America, it can feel hopeless. But I'm not one to despair.
Well,
and
that brings.
I should add to that. I mean, that it genuinely, we can. I believe that that God actually is in the midst of us, and that we can have a kind of hopefulness. I mean, one of the things when I was talking about theological resources a little while ago, I mean, one of the theological resources we can come to is the work of atonement, that Christ has genuinely died for the sin of the world. Racism is a part of the sin of the world. It doesn't mean that we can sort of kind of gloss over it. That I see that as being a future reality in the age to come. There's not going to be racism, and that we can have a kind of confident hope that that this is what God wants in the world, is for there to be people who are treated with dignity and equally, and that as we're going along the way, I'm consoled to know that that God is already waiting there and is present here to bring this into I think what I'm trying to say is, we're going to do all the things we can do as human beings, but to recognize that it is in fact a divine work that needs to take place in order for racism to be overcome in our time.
And that should be a real encouragement to pastors who are tempted to talk about this stuff, but who are going to face like really disappointing reactions from some influential congregation members, because what you're basically saying is we're licensed to not be judged by our apparent results. And Damien asks, how can we encourage leadership? And we just have to encourage them to be faithful to the message that they've been entrusted with. And their job isn't necessarily to constantly grow and to constantly have harmony. Sometimes the dissent and the aggro is healthy, and you're doing the right thing, even if it is generating all kinds of heated debates. There should be great freedom in knowing that God hasn't abandoned us.
Yeah, I would add to Damien's questions around. I can sympathize. I was a pastor at a church that was primarily a white church, this one in Arkansas. And when we made a decisive step that we've said we are going to be a church that wants to actively work towards racial reconciliation and racial inclusion, and made real efforts towards that, this church in America, it was about 600 attendees on a Sunday. And I don't know what that translates into in kind of an Irish context, but when we made that move, about 200 people left the church. About a third of our congregation said, and of course they don't say, we're leaving because you guys have gotten all this interested in race. It's, we feel led to go to another place, or, just never, this kind of a quiet attrition. But about a third of the congregation left. And then the encouragement would be is that those numbers were filled back up with people who found that this was a kind of vibrancy in our church that they were not experiencing in other places, and that we were a kind of church that was willing to do this kind of really relevant work within the community. People were energized by that as well. So if people are afraid of driving people off, that there's a silver lining of sorts. And again, back to this idea of a hopefulness that God is going to meet us in the midst of doing this work.
Thank you. That kind of leads us on to the last question then, which was, are you hopeful that church's problems with racism can be transformed? And is there anything happening in different areas which gives you this hope? I think you've partially answered that just there.
I have partially. Yeah. And then I'd maybe just come back to, we can be so myopic in our thinking about what's happening in the church. At least I know Americans are particularly guilty of this, that whatever's happening here is the most important thing happening within Christianity. And to recognize that Christianity is a global movement is, I mean, we're so in the minority, and to think that what we're doing is the most important thing. I take a lot of encouragement from knowing that our brothers and sisters in Africa and Asia and other places are thriving in their ministries, and that they're seeing God's work, which isn't to say that they will encounter the same us-them kinds of problems. They do encounter the same kinds of us-them problems, but that our particular instantiation of it doesn't necessarily need to replicate in other contexts. I take a lot of encouragement from that.
Thank you. And does anybody else have any questions to put in the Q&A, or Kevin, do you have any final comments?
I see that there's a question there about the Vatican kind of taking the lead, and I'm able to declare with some amount of credibility when the Catholic Church is taking the lead, because I'm not a member of the Catholic Church. And if you look at the Amazonian Synod, it is a remarkable event in the history of the church, because that's the church turning its attention fully, the global church institutionally turning its attention towards this especially significant ecosystem and the people therein, and that conversation being led by the people from the Amazon. So that's a very real example of governance from the very top, including the voices who are the kind of definition of marginalized. And then when you pair that with Fratelli Tutti, which is this papal encyclical, this rousing call to social friendship, to fraternity as this social virtue that must be paired with liberty and equality to genuinely make a flourishing society, what you do have is like a very clear signal that under Francis's papacy, the church is not going to address this head on in the terms that we're familiar with, because as Taido said, the terms we're familiar with are determined by America, not by the world. And it would be like a very weird situation for the church to approach things in terms that are familiar or native to Anglo speakers. But in its own way, I would say that there are things developing there that need to be encouraged and recognized as remarkably different from what would have happened before. So it's do other faith traditions offer such models and thoughts? My honest position is that, as a Presbyterian who would be fairly familiar with what's happening in the World Council of Churches and the World Council of Reformed Churches and all these other bodies, we're behind the Catholic Church on this. So there's reason there to be hopeful. Yeah, I see that there's recommendations for books there. And my final question to Taido was if he could recommend reading if somebody wanted to pursue this. What would you? Where would you direct them?
Sure. And again, my apologies for the American-centric kind of reading list that this is inevitably going to be, but there have been, I think the first book, or maybe depends on what a person's interest is, but there's a theologian named Willie Jennings out of Yale doing some extraordinary work on particularly historical work and on the ways in which Christianity is the theological formation that's taken place for Christians in not just America, but in the West, generally speaking, and sort of unpacking how racism came to be embodied so distinctly within Christian context, and offering not just a prognosis, but maybe a way forward. So Willie Jennings would be good. The Christian Imagination. An easier, more accessible book, and again, this would be an exercise in American history, but the degree to which the same kinds of dynamics replicate themselves in other places. Jamar Tisby's The Color of Compromise, I found very helpful for people to introduce people to the ways in which Christianity was used in inappropriate ways. He doesn't major so much on the ways that it was offering kind of hope and resiliency for both white and African-American Christians who were interested in equality and dignity for slaves and Black people. But I think that's a helpful book for recognizing that. And then this one doesn't hit race head on, but as far as thinking through reconciliation and the kinds of forgiveness processes and repentance processes, Miroslav Volf's Exclusion and Embrace is a kind of classic. It's maybe the best thing he's potentially ever written, and I think it stands the test of time for helping people to think through some of these very complicated issues of division and oppression. And then lastly, I'd be remiss to not mention James Cone, who is considered the father of Black theology in America. He wrote important works in the 1970s that were introducing Black theology as a form of liberation theology. And the theological reflection that he did in that is, I think, worth thinking through. I don't necessarily, not all of it resonates wholly with me, but there are parts of it that have really challenged me to kind of second guess my instinctual kind of Reformed heritage. And so that's been a helpful book for me as well.
I've added them in there in the chat box if people want to copy and paste that for taking down to their local bookshop to order for Christmas. So thank you.
That's my reading list. I'm sure somebody else would have a different kind of reading list. But.
Thank you. Well, I think we're at the end. And just to mention that the other book that was mentioned was My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. And that's by Irene McGuire. So if you want to add that in as well, Kevin, that would be great. So that brings us to the end.
Thank you very much, Taido, for joining us. And thank you especially to all the attendees who joined us, and for your questions and for your dialogue. And we look forward to hosting future webinars about topics as hopefully as interesting as this. So once again, thank you to Taido, and thank you to you all. And I hope you have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.
See you.